My late grandmother left me a tiny, falling-apart house in the middle of nowhere's inheritance, and my sister got a huge downtown apartment. My husband got angry and kicked me out. I moved to countryside, and when I saw what I had inherited, I couldn't believe my eyes. The sound of heels against polish would echo sharply in the sterile stillness of the attorney's office. Emily Carter sat on the edge of a leather armchair that felt too rigid, her hands locked tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were pale, her fingernails bitten raw from a sleepless week. The only thing grounding her was the worn-out silk scarf looped around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, Edith, whose absence now filled the room like a silent siren. Across from her, Lindsay Carter, her younger sister by 4 years, tapped absent-mindedly on her phone screen, red lacquer nails flashing with every swipe. The lawyer, a thin man with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like crinkled paper, cleared his throat and began to read. The will was detailed, almost poetic in its phrasing. First came the sentimental things: a gold locket, a first edition of a poetry book, a recipe journal stained with decades of chocolate and cinnamon. Then the properties. Emily sat up straighter, expecting little but hoping, as one does when grief hasn't yet hardened into realism. To my granddaughter, Lindsay Carter, the lawyer read, I leave the apartment at 5th and Lavaca in Austin, fully paid and furnished. Emily's breath caught. The modern apartment in downtown Austin, the one with wraparound balconies and skyline views, that apartment was worth hundreds of thousands. She turned toward her sister, who off her shrug that barely concealed a smug grin. The lawyer continued, to my granddaughter, Emily Carter, I leave the house located in Deer Creek Hollow, Travis County. The keys are in the possession of the state executor. Emily blinked. Deer Creek Hollow. That had to be the ramshackle property her grandmother used to mention in passing. Something about old days, summers that smelled of cedar and rain. A tiny, aging house nestled somewhere between forgotten backroads and sweltering pastures. That's it? She asked aloud before she could filter herself. Her voice cracked the silence. The lawyer gave her a soft glance, folded his hands, and said, there are also some personal effects left behind. You may find more once you visit the property. The meeting ended shortly after. Lindsay stood and stretched like a cat, already texting someone, probably planning her next rooftop brunch. Emily exited into the street feeling like she had stepped into a different life, one she hadn't signed up for. The downtown skyline shimmered in the distance, sun-kissed and unreachable. When she told Mark about the inheritance, she expected confusion, maybe sympathy. What she got was rage. Are you kidding me? He snapped, his voice echoing to the small living room of their rented duplex. Your sister gets a luxury apartment, and we get... What? A decaying barn in the middle of nowhere. It's a house. It's a joke, Emily. That's what it is. Just like every decision you've made since we got married. She recoiled as if struck. I didn't choose this. No, but you're choosing to drag us down with it. I'm not starting over in some backwater swamp with no power, no internet, and probably snakes in the kitchen. It's not a swamp, she whispered, although she had no idea what kind of condition the house was in. It's my grandmother's. She left it for me. Mark didn't yell again. He just stared at her with something worse, disappointment, the kind that settles in the corners of the mouth and behind the eyes. By the weekend, she was gone. She packed what she could fit into her Corolla, some books, her teaching certificates, a box of family photos, and the scarf. She didn't even have a real destination pinned on her GPS, only an address scribbled in the margins of an old letter her grandmother once wrote her. It took her nearly 6 hours to reach the area, the last 40 minutes winding through cracked county roads and clusters of trees bowed from decades of wind. The sun had dipped into a bruised horizon by the time she turned off the main road onto a gravel path lined with dried mesquite. There it was. The house looked exactly like her grandmother had described it, though age had dimmed its edges. A single-story cottage with faded blue shutters, a roof that sagged in places, and a porch with missing planks. Wild grasses hugged its sides like forgotten lovers. A mailbox stood crooked near the gate, rusted at the hinge. Emily parked the car and just sat for a minute, her eyes scanning the scene, her throat tight. She stepped out. The wind was dry and carried the scent of cedar wood and dust. Her shoes crunched against gravel as she walked toward the porch. The door was locked. She sighed, rubbed her temples, and almost laughed. Then, remembering something, she crouched beside the front steps. A memory stirred. Her grandmother once told her about hiding secret letters in a tin box beneath a loose plank. She felt along the wood until her fingers found a groove. The plank lifted with a soft creak. Beneath it, nestled in a hollow, was a metal tin, dulled by time but intact. Inside lay a single brass key on a ribbon of red twine and a folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded the note. The handwriting was unmistakable, looped and elegant. Dear Emily, if you found this, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Come inside. There's more waiting for you than you realize. A chill ran through her. She stood slowly, key in hand, and walked back to the door. The lock turned easily. As the door creaked open, the smell of old wood, lavender, and something faintly metallic drifted toward her. The living room was dim, bathed in the amber light of the setting sun. Everything was covered in sheets, like a house holding its breath. Dust motes danced in the air, catching the light like tiny stars. Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She had nowhere else to go. But maybe, just maybe, this place was more than it seemed. The air inside the house was thick with time. Emily wandered to the front room slowly, her fingers grazing the tops of draped furniture and wooden moldings. Beneath each cloth covering was a remnant of her grandmother's careful curation. A rocking chair carved with floral motifs, a small lamp with a stained glass shade, a faded tapestry of blue, and ochre hung loosely on one wall. Nothing had been touched in years, yet there was an undeniable order to it all, like the house had been waiting for her. The kitchen smelled of cedar and aged paper. A stack of unopened mail sat near the sink, each envelope yellowing at the edges. Drawers stuck slightly when she pulled them open, revealing kitchen tools that hadn't been used in decades. Under the sink, she found an old broom and began sweeping, pushing years of dust and leaves into piles near the door. The act gave her purpose, direction. By the time the moon had risen and the crickets began their chorus outside, she had managed to clear the kitchen and part of the hallway. Still, the house felt like a riddle waiting to be solved. The following morning, Emily woke curled on the old floral couch, a blanket she didn't remember pulling over herself tucked under her chin. Light filtered through cracked blinds, illuminating specks of dust that floated lazily in the quiet. She sat up slowly, joints stiff from the unfamiliar bed, and glanced around. The silence was comforting, but also hollow. She rose, stretched, and made herself a cup of tea using water from a jug and a portable kettle she'd brought in from the car. As she sat at the kitchen table sipping from a chipped mug, her eyes caught sight of a wooden cabinet with tarnished brass handles. It looked slightly out of place, as if it had been moved recently. Curiosity pushed her forward. She opened the top drawer and found old napkins, recipe cards, and loose photographs. One in particular held her attention. A picture of her grandmother standing in front of the same house, young and vibrant, holding a paintbrush and laughing. Emily flipped it over. In faint ink were the words, Spring, 1973, the beginning of the end. That same year was marked on the property map she had found yesterday, the one she had tucked inside her purse. She remembered the note, shed 1973. With the sun still low in the sky and the air crisp, she ventured outside. Behind the house, past what remained of a vegetable garden now overgrown with weeds, stood a small wooden structure half hidden by tall grass. The shed, its roof sagged in the center, and ivy curled along its sides like a slow embrace. The door protested when she pushed it open, hinges groaning like an old man waking from sleep. Inside, the shed was dark and smelled of sawdust and oil. Dust blanketed every surface, and a few broken tools lay scattered across a workbench. A stack of wooden crates was pushed into one corner. Emily peeled back a tarp, her breath catching as she revealed what lay beneath. Framed artworks, dozens of them, carefully arranged and covered as if someone had taken great care to protect them from moisture and decay. She pulled one frame free and held it up to the sliver of sunlight streaming through a crack in the wall. The signature in the bottom corner was faint but unmistakable. A. Calder, 1972. Her heart skipped. Alexander Calder? That was impossible. And yet the piece had all the hallmarks: mobility, abstract forms, balance. She set it down carefully and examined another, then another. Each one bore a different name, but all were signed and numbered, many from artists whose work she vaguely remembered from art history classes. Some frames had labels. Others were wrapped in parchment and bound with twine. The deeper she looked, the more surreal it became. This wasn't just a stash of decorative pieces. These were originals. Emily's hands trembled as she lifted a small painting no larger than a record sleeve, its colors vibrant and brushwork intense. A slip of paper was tucked behind it, written in her grandmother's hand. This collection was never meant to be hidden, but sometimes the right thing becomes the hardest thing to do. Keep it safe. Someday, someone will understand. She sat back on her heels, her mind reeling. Had her grandmother really stored priceless art in a shed behind a dilapidated house? Why? Where had they come from? And what did she mean by the right thing? That evening, Emily brought a few of the pieces inside and laid them gently on the dining room table. She avoided turning on any lights near the windows, nervous that even a glance from a passerby might trigger the wrong kind of attention. She didn't know the value of what she had found, not exactly, but instinct told her it was worth more than she could comprehend. She returned to the living room and opened the chest near the fireplace, the one she had noticed earlier but had been too exhausted to explore. Inside were books, handwritten journals, and bundles of letters tied with ribbon. Emily selected a journal bound in dark leather and opened it to a random page. Her grandmother's voice leapt from the page like a ghost. May 5th, 1980. They wanted collection moved to New York, but I couldn't trust them. He vanished without warning, and no one asked questions. I've kept what I could. Not for me. For her. Someday, she'll need to know what it means to guard something sacred. Emily flipped through more pages. Her grandmother's notes were fragmented but filled with emotion, observations about museum politics, powerful men, art smugglers, and collectors who paid fortunes for pieces that were never meant to be sold. It became clear that Edith had been involved in a world far beyond what Emily had ever imagined. Late into the night, Emily read by the soft light of a table lamp, the journal balanced on her lap, the paintings nearby. She felt something awakening inside her, not just grief or curiosity, but a sense of responsibility. These pieces, these words, had been protected for a reason, and now that responsibility had fallen to her. Just before sleep claimed her again on the couch, she returned to the shed, flashlight in hand, and found another letter tucked beneath the floorboards, this one sealed in wax. The envelope read only, "Emily, if you're reading this, it means the world did not break you." Inside, the letter was longer than the others, more personal. Her grandmother spoke of choices, of keeping collection quiet for decades, unsure of who to trust. She had waited for a sign, for someone with enough heart to understand that value isn't always measured in money. If you choose to sell, do it wisely. If you choose to keep it, protect it fiercely. But whatever you do, do it with love. That's all that ever mattered. Emily pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. The house was old. The paint was peeling. The nights were cold. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. The next morning, the stillness of the house was interrupted only by the hum of the kettle and the distant trill of mockingbirds. Emily sat on the porch steps, legs folded beneath her, cradling a mug of weak coffee. The early sunlight filtered through the trees in golden shafts, casting long shadows across the untamed yard. After days of absorbing fragmented truths, she knew it was time to start putting the pieces together. The journal entries, the art, the cryptic instructions, none of it could be dismissed as coincidence. Her grandmother, Edith, had lived a life far more complex than anyone in the family had realized, and Emily was now to keep her secrets she was only beginning to understand. By mid-morning, she was back inside, crouched over a pile of journals and letters in what must have once been Edith's bedroom. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, and the dresser held traces of the past meticulously preserved. Combs, bottles of perfume, hand-sewn sachets tucked in drawers. Emily flipped open a larger, cloth-bound book, thicker than the others. Inside were pages of notes dated from the mid-1950s through the late 1980s, each entry chronicling museum projects, artwork restoration techniques, and interactions with people she referred only by initials or vague descriptors. The Italian, the patron are the quiet man from Marseille. Some entries described the painstaking process of cleaning pigments without damaging layers of original color. Others recorded entire dialogues during clandestine meetings about transportation and valuation of artwork, always wrapped in an undertone of caution. What struck Emily most was the duality in her grandmother's life. She hadn't just worked at museums. She had lived in their shadows, involved in preservation, but also clearly concealment. In one passage dated June of 1974, Edith described a sudden, chaotic shift in her responsibilities. A collector, unnamed but referred to as a gentleman, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Legal ownership of several pieces became uncertain, and a few trusted staff had taken matters into their own hands, removing the most vulnerable works from storage before they could be lost or sold into the black market. Edith was one of them. They told me it would be temporary. One entry read, "Just until things settled." But years passed, and no one came forward. And I couldn't trust the museums anymore, not after what I saw. The realization settled heavily in Emily's chest. The artworks had been in hiding for decades because Edith feared what would happen to them otherwise. Whether it was out of loyalty to a collector or guilt or a fierce moral code, she had chosen secrecy over restitution. And now that duty had somehow passed to Emily, driven by this revelation. She decided to visit the town records office, a few miles away in the center of the nearest small town. She dressed in a pair of clean jeans and a cardigan and drove into the low-lying hills, her mind churning with questions. The municipal building was modest, its windows shuttered against the heat. Inside, the clerk was a soft-spoken man in his 60s named Harold, who wore wire-rimmed glasses and a BOLO tie. When she asked about the Deer Creek Hollow property, he raised an eyebrow. "You're the Carter girl, huh?" he asked, typing slowly on an outdated keyboard. "Yes, I just inherited the house from my grandmother." He nodded. "I remember Edith. Quiet lady, but sharp as a whip. Used to come here every so often to update the paperwork herself. Always refused to let it go to auction, even when taxes stacked up. Said the land was special." "What do you mean, special?" Emily asked, trying not to sound too eager. "Well," Harold said, swiveling his monitor toward her, "you see this section of land?" He pointed at a color-coded map. "This strip, including your lot, was recently surveyed for an ecological development project. Conservation land, hiking trails, that kind of thing. The foundation's been buying up parcels all along the hillside, offered nearly double market value for some of them." Emily's heart skipped. "Are they still buying?" "They've got contracts pending. But your land's in a key position. Access road cuts right through the southern end. Without your parcel, the whole plan gets complicated." She stared at the screen, then at Harold. "And my grandmother knew this?" "I reckon she did. She was always 10 steps ahead." Emily left the office with a copy of the parcel history and a lot more questions. If Edith had been sitting on land the developers were quietly fighting over and also hiding millions of dollars worth of art, then the situation was far more precarious than she'd realized. It wasn't just about family legacy anymore. There were people, organizations, even who might have a vested interest in either buying her out or making sure certain pieces of information never came to light. As the sun began to set behind the hills, Emily sat on the back porch and reread the letter her grandmother had left in the shed. The words took on a new gravity. "You have what matters," Edith had written, "but knowing what to do with it, that will be your trial." Emily understood now that she had inherited more than just a property or some forgotten treasures. She had inherited a responsibility to carry forward a story that had been buried for decades, one that could easily disappear again if she wasn't careful. That night, her sleep was restless. She dreamed of narrow museum hallways and whispers in foreign languages, of long wooden crates being lowered into basements, and of her grandmother's voice echoing over and over, "Do it with love." When she awoke in the early dawn, she didn't reach for coffee or her notebook. Instead, she stood in the living room, surrounded by the covered furniture and stacks of unframed canvases, and felt something settle deep inside her, a decision forming, even if she didn't have words for it yet. She began making calls. Quiet ones. She looked up the nearest gallery in Austin that dealt in mid-century American art and arranged a meeting with a woman named Teresa Gibbons, who agreed to drive out in a few days under the pretense of an appraisal. Emily offered no details over the phone, just the promise of pieces that needed care, restoration, and maybe even a second life. She also began restoring the house itself. One room at a time, she cleared away years of neglect. She painted the front porch in soft green, replaced broken windows, and trimmed the overgrown grass with a borrowed mower from a neighbor who introduced himself simply as Ray and asked no questions. Each act of care felt like a conversation with her grandmother. Each improvement made the house breathe a little easier. By the end of the week, the old property no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning, still fragile, still surrounded by unanswered questions, but breathing again, like a secret finally ready to be told. The arrival of Teresa Gibbons was nothing like Emily had imagined. Instead of the sleek, polished gallery she had feared might come with briefcases and questions that sliced too deep, Teresa was warm, curious, and practical. She drove an aging station wagon, wore faded jeans and a wide-brimmed hat, and arrived with a clipboard, a canvas bag full of brushes and gloves, and a gentle but focused demeanor. When Emily opened the front door, Teresa extended a hand without hesitation and said, "You're the one who made the call. Let's see what you've got." They moved through the house, slowly, carefully. Teresa didn't gawk or exclaim when she saw the first paintings. She studied them in silence, crouching to examine the edges, her fingers always hovering but never touching. Only after she had gone through 10 or so did she speak. "These are real," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Some of them I recognize instantly. Limited prints, yes, but not mass market. These were distributed in closed circles. Private collectors, museum loans. Others," she trailed off, lifting a delicate pastel sketch with signature Emily still hadn't deciphered. "These might never been cataloged." Emily sat across from her at the dining room table, heart pounding. "What does that mean?" "It means," Teresa said, carefully placing the piece back down, "that if this collection was never disclosed, there's a reason. And if it's real, and for what I've seen so far it is, then its value isn't just financial. It's historical." Teresa offered to return within the week with her husband, a retired conservator, to begin cataloging the pieces. She emphasized confidentiality, promised discretion, and gave Emily her direct number, asking her to call if anything seemed suspicious or if people began asking questions. Before leaving, she turned at the doorway. "Whatever this place becomes, Emily," she said, "don't let anyone rush you. Pieces like these attract stories. Some are beautiful, some are dangerous." By the time Teresa's car disappeared down the gravel road, Emily already felt the shift. Word, it seemed, had begun to spread. 2 days later, Lindsay arrived unannounced. The knock on the door was loud, impatient. Emily opened it to find her younger sister dressed in a sleek blazer and sunglasses, standing with the air of someone who had just walked off a runway and into the wrong movie set. Without asking, Lindsay stepped inside, wrinkling her nose. "God, it smells like mildew and regrets in here," she said, setting her designer bag on the nearest chair. "You seriously live like this now?" Emily didn't reply. She crossed her arms and waited. Lindsay sighed and glanced around. "Look, I came because, well, I've been thinking maybe the will wasn't fair. Grandma was old. Maybe she made a mistake." Emily narrowed her eyes. She didn't. "Emily, come on. You've always been the sentimental one. But this," Lindsay gestured around. "You're squatting in a shack when you could be living downtown with a view of the skyline. And yet, Emily said, her voice even, "Here you are." Lindsay ignored the jab. "Rumors are already circulating. You know, people are saying you found something here. Paintings, maybe. Antiques. Real estate guys are interested too. Did you know your lot might block $1 million eco project?" Emily didn't answer. She walked to the table and picked up a sealed envelope she hadn't opened yet, part of the final batch of letters her grandmother had stored in the chest. She wasn't ready to read it, but holding it gave her a sense of calm. Lindsay's tone shifted. "I'm just saying, if there's something valuable here, we could share it. You don't have to do this alone." Emily looked up. This was never about money. Not for her. And not for me. Lindsay scoffed, grabbed her bag, and muttered something under her breath as she walked out. Emily didn't bother to follow. The next day, Mark called. His voice was cautious, too measured. "Emily," I heard from Lindsay. "She's worried about you." Emily let the silence stretch until he added, "I've been thinking too. Maybe I overreacted. This move, it could be good for us. A new start." Emily almost laughed. "You didn't want a new start when I had nowhere else to go." "I know. I made a mistake. But if there's a way we can turn this into something solid, if there's value there, I could come help. We could do it together." The words stung, but not because she wanted to believe them. They stung because she no longer did. Emily thanked him politely and hung up before the call could turn manipulative. She spent the rest of the week clearing out the largest room in the house, the one with the best light, and converted it into a working space. She bought supplies, brushes, gloves, a magnifying lamp. With Teresa's guidance, she started restoring minor pieces herself, those too delicate to transport yet too important to leave untouched. She researched conservation techniques, reached out to local artists, and began quietly assembling something she hadn't dared name yet. It was only when a local teen, Maya, knocked on the door asking if Emily needed help painting the fence, word having gotten around that the art lady was fixing up the place, that Emily realized the idea had taken root. She explained a bit about her plan to create a community art space. Maya returned the next day with 2 friends and a bucket of brushes. Within weeks, Emily had half a dozen teens helping her prep walls, clean floors, build storage. Some had never held a paintbrush before. Others brought sketchbooks. The shed became an informal classroom. The living room, an impromptu gallery. Laughter returned to property, and the wind felt different, less like something passing through, more like something arriving. At the opening celebration, neighbors and friends gathered under strings of borrowed lights. Tables were lined with lemonade, cookies, and hand-painted signs welcoming guests. Local musicians played quietly on the porch. Inside, the walls were lined with student artwork, interspersed with the framed restorations Emily and Teresa had managed to prepare. As dusk settled, an older man arrived, walking slowly with the help of a wooden cane. He had silver hair, a pressed linen shirt, and eyes that moved across the room with careful intent. He paused at one of the restored paintings, then turned to Emily. "Your name's Carter?" he asked. She nodded. "Emily Carter. This was my grandmother's home." The man smiled gently. "Then you might be the person I've been searching for a very long time." Emily studied the man's face. His voice carried the weight of years, and though his posture was steady, she could see the effort behind each step he took. The cane he held was dark, polished, and carved with intricate designs, swirls and symbols she didn't recognize, but that felt deliberate. He stood near the far wall of the makeshift gallery where a few of the restored paintings were displayed, quietly examining a piece she had just finished mounting earlier that day. She took a breath and walked toward him. "You said you've been looking for someone?" she asked, cautious but curious. The man turned to her, his eyes a gray so pale they seemed to glow under the string lights overhead. He nodded slowly. "I believe you may be Edith's granddaughter." "I am." He smiled, a wistful motion that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I knew her a long time ago. My name is Elliot Mason. My father was Alistair Mason." Emily blinked. The name tugged at something. One of the labels she'd seen on the back of a canvas, initials she hadn't been able to place. He was a collector, wasn't he? Elliot nodded. More than that, he was a patron of the obscure, a believer in forgotten names and unsellable brilliance. During the 70s, he entrusted several of his most prized pieces to your grandmother. Edith was the only one he trusted to restore and protect them. When he disappeared in 1981, the trail went cold. No one knew what happened to the works. My family tried to track her down, but Edith had vanished deliberately, it seemed. Emily's mind spun. The implications were dizzying. She never mentioned a Mason by name, only referred to someone as the gentleman. That was him, Elliot said, his gaze drifting toward a framed charcoal sketch. Always formal, always private, but deeply passionate about preserving meaning through art, not for prestige or profit, for memory. They sat on the bench near the window, and he spoke more softly. My father knew his time was limited. There were whispers of legal trouble, accusations he couldn't disprove. He left the country, trying to shield what he valued most, not his fortune, but his collection. Edith was the only person who didn't ask him for anything in return. She understood the importance of the art itself. Emily was silent for a long moment. She kept everything hidden. She even wrote in her journals that she was afraid to let anyone see them. She thought if the wrong people found out, the pieces would be taken, misused, maybe lost forever. Elliot nodded solemnly. She wasn't wrong. After my father's disappearance, there were collectors, agents, even government inquiries. The collection became myth. And now, finding this, seeing how carefully you preserved it, it's almost too much. Emily looked around the room. The gallery wasn't grand, but it was real. Youthful voices echoed faintly from the back porch, where the teens were laughing and cleaning up from the event. Paint still stained the edges of the floor, and the scent of turpentine clung to the air. She thought of the long days of labor, the nights reading through journals by lamplight, the quiet moments where her grief had turned into resolve. I don't know what to do with it all, she admitted. I've had offers to sell. I've had people asking about the land. But this place, it's become something more than just a house, more than a hiding place. Elliot leaned forward, resting both hands on the top of his cane. I don't want a collection returned, he said. If my father were alive, he wouldn't want that either. He believed art should live where it is loved, where it can breathe, not in a vault. Emily frowned. Then why come here? Why now? To see if it was in the right hands, he answered. And it is... He paused, pulling a small envelope from his coat pocket. Inside were a few documents, handwritten notes, old photographs, and an official-looking letterhead bearing the crest of a now-defunct Arts Foundation. These belong to my father, he said. There's one item he never found before he disappeared, an unpublished ledger. It was said to contain records of the entire collection's provenance, including works never registered with museums. If it exists, it could validate everything and protect you legally. Emily accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. You think she might have kept it? If she did, it's hidden well. After Elliot left, promising to return in the following week, Emily sat alone and quiet. The teens had gone. The gallery was still. She held the envelope like a fragile artifact, aware that it might contain the final piece of her grandmother's puzzle. But more than that, it confirmed something she had only dare hope, that what she had built, despite the odds and uncertainty, was worthy of what had been left behind. That night, Emily didn't sleep. Instead, she returned to the old chest by the fireplace. With renewed purpose, she combed through its contents, not looking for beauty or legacy this time, but for truth. Folded within a bundle of pages was a worn, cloth-bound booklet. No title, no date. She opened it, heart pounding, and saw a list, long and meticulous, of works, artists, and acquisition dates. Some were crossed out. Others had asterisks and notes in the margins. At the very back, in Edith's elegant script, was a single sentence. If you have found this, then you understand. The inheritance was never the objects. It was a decision. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, not from sorrow but from relief. The journey had not been about reclaiming value. It had been about recognizing it. She thought of the young artists who had found their voice within the walls of this old house, of the neighbors who had brought over hammers and food without being asked, of Teresa, who had treated the paintings not as commodities but as companions. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Elliot worked together quietly. He connected her with archivists and historians who could authenticate the pieces without drawing attention. The foundation, once a rumor, was reimagined as a nonprofit centered on art education and preservation. With Emily as its director, she refused to sell the land, though the offers doubled and tripled. Instead, she expanded the community space, converting the shed into a permanent gallery for collection. Carefully curated, accessible, and protected, the house remained her home. The room still carried echoes of Edith's presence, but now they also held laughter, music, and the murmur of young minds discovering color for the first time. In the quiet hours of early morning, Emily sometimes wrote letters to herself, a habit she had once found odd in her grandmother, but now understood deeply. One evening, she placed a new letter beneath the floorboard where the first key had been hidden. It read, "Sometimes the things we inherit are broken, old, or unwanted, but sometimes they are exactly what we needed to become who we were always meant to be." And with that, Emily Carter began not just a new chapter, but a legacy of her own.